Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War. C-141 transport aircraft roared low over the southern coast, their ramps yawning open as wind and noise flooded the fuselages. Red jump lights flicked to green, Army Rangers stepped into space, parachutes snapping open against the pre-dawn sky. This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to Cold War history. Please make sure you follow us in your podcast app so you don't miss future episodes. The US invasion of Grenada in 1983 remains a pivotal event in both Caribbean and Cold War history. President Reagan, fearing the spread of communism in the Caribbean and the safety of US civilians, initiated the military action. US forces aimed to rapidly seize control of the island and restore order. However, the operation was fraught with challenges, intelligence failures, miscommunications, and the chaotic nature of the military operation raised questions about the effectiveness of US planning and coordination. As history often shows, the smallest conflicts can have the most profound impacts, shaping policies and perceptions for decades to come. Part 1. The Island Before Dawn. Just before dawn on the 25th of October 1983, the island of Grenada lay under a tense artificial quiet. The curfew imposed 6 days earlier had emptied the streets. The shops were shuttered, radios silent, and the soldiers of the People's Revolutionary Army stood at checkpoints with fingers near triggers. In the humid darkness along the southern coast, surf broke against coral beaches near a half-finished runway at Point Salines. While offshore the silhouettes of American warships held position, lights darkened, aircraft spotted on decks. Within minutes, parachutes would bloom in the sky and helicopters would sweep inland. The Cold War, abstract to most Grenadians, was about to arrive at ground level. The US-led invasion that followed, codenamed Operation Urgent Fury, would last little more than a week. Yet it was the culmination of years of political decay, ideological rivalry and miscalculation, both on the island and far beyond it. To understand how American Rangers came to be dropping onto a Caribbean airstrip at dawn, one must begin not with the assault itself, but with the slow unravelling of Grenada's post-colonial experiment. Grenada achieved independence from Britain in 1974, inheriting fragile institutions and an economy dependent on agriculture and tourism. Power rested with Prime Minister Eric Gairy, a populist whose rule became synonymous with corruption, intimidation and the use of private militias. By the late 1970s, opposition had coalesced around a Marxist influence movement calling itself the New Dual Movement. In March 1979, while Gairy was abroad, the movement seized power in a near-bloodless coup led by Maurice Bishop. Bishop's People's Revolutionary Government suspended the constitution, postponed elections, and aligned itself openly with Cuba and the Socialist Bloc. The new leadership promised literacy campaigns, healthcare, and participatory democracy. It also centralised power, restricted dissent and relied increasingly on security forces trained and equipped by Havana. Cuban engineers and workers arrived to help construct a modern international airport at Point Salines, an economic project in Grenadian eyes, but one that Washington viewed with suspicion in the context of East-West rivalry. Scholars and journalists would later note that Grenada's turn towards Cuba and the Soviet Union, while real, was as much pragmatic as ideological, driven by isolation from Western aid and fear of counter-revolution. In 1983, Bishop's government was under strain. Economic performance lagged behind expectations, and a hardline faction within the ruling party, led by Deputy Prime Minister Bernard Cord, pressed for tighter ideological discipline. The internal struggle turned lethal in October. Bishop was placed under house arrest, freed by supporters, then captured again by the army. On the 19th of October 1983, he and several close allies were executed at Fort Rupert. The killings shocked Grenadians and reverberated abroad. In the aftermath, a revolutionary military council under General Hudson Austin declared a shoot-to-kill curfew and sealed the island's borders. Communications were cut, ports closed, and political life frozen. To outside observers, Grenada appeared suddenly opaque and unstable. To the Reagan administration in Washington, the images and reports arriving from the Caribbean intersected with broader anxieties. The memory of the Iranian hostage crisis, the ongoing wars in Central America, and determination to reassert American credibility after Vietnam. The official rationale that soon emerged emphasized the safety of US citizens, particularly several hundred medical students at St. George's University. Yet contemporary reporting and later scholarly analysis make clear that the situation on the island, while grim and authoritarian, did not involve widespread attacks on foreigners or active hostage-taking. British diplomats on the ground reported calm returning after the initial violence, and Grenadian authorities made efforts to reassure the university community. These nuances would largely be lost in the compressed decision-making of Washington. At the same time, leaders of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, small island governments unsettled by the spectacle of revolutionary violence so close to home, discussed external intervention. Their concerns, mixed with US pressure and planning already underway, produced a regional request for assistance whose legal and political standing would be fiercely debated afterward. By the 22nd of October, planning for a military operation was advancing rapidly. Secrecy was extreme, intelligence incomplete. As later military reviews would document, US planners lacked reliable maps, underestimated the complexity of the island's terrain, and struggled to coordinate amongst services. Nonetheless, the decision was made. President Ronald Reagan approved an intervention that would combine Rangers, Marines, airborne troops, special operations forces, and naval aviation in the largest American combat action since Vietnam. The stated objectives were clear and ambitious: protect US nationals, restore order, and remove Cuban and Marxist influence from Grenada. Critics would later argue that these aims blurred into one another, masking regime change beneath humanitarian language. Defenders would insist that speed and decisiveness prevented chaos and bloodshed. Both interpretations draw support from the historical record. As the night of 24th of October gave way to morning, Grenada's fate hung in the balance. On Point Salines, soldiers of the People's Revolutionary Army manned anti-aircraft guns beside an unfinished runway whose strategic meaning had been debated for years. Offshore, American commanders watched the clock. Above the island, transport aircraft lined up in the darkness, their crews rehearsing drop procedures over unfamiliar terrain. When the first Rangers stepped into the void just before sunrise, the political crisis that had begun with a party feud and an execution became an international military confrontation. What followed would expose both the strength and deep flaws in America's joint warfare, reshape US military organization, and leave a lasting imprint on Grenada itself. The invasion was about to begin, but its roots lay firmly in the turbulent years that preceded that quietly breath-held dawn. Part 2. H hour at Point Salines. At 5:34 a.m. on the 25th of October 1983, the blackness above Grenada fractured. C-141 transport aircraft roared low over the southern coast, their ramps yawning open as wind and noise flooded the fuselages. Red jump lights flicked to green. Army Rangers stepped into space, parachutes snapping open against the pre-dawn sky. Below them lay the long, unfinished runway at Point Salines, wet with dew, ringed with scrub and construction equipment, and defended by Grenadian troops who'd been awake all night, unsure whether the silence offshore meant relief or catastrophe. Within seconds, anti-aircraft fire clawed upwards. Tracers stitched the air. Some parachutists landed under fire, others hit hard on the asphalt or in the surrounding brush. The invasion of Grenada had begun. The plan called for speed and synchronization. At Point Salines, the Rangers' task was to seize the runway so follow-on aircraft carrying the 82nd Airborne Division could land. Far to the north, US Marines were moving by helicopter towards Pearls Airport, a smaller strip serving the island's eastern parishes. Special operations teams were already ashore near St. George's, tasked with securing key sites, including Governor House, where Governor-General Paul Scone was confined. The Governor-General was the representative of the Grenadian monarch, and in Grenada, in 1983, That was Queen Elizabeth II. What planners had not fully anticipated was how fragmented their intelligence was. Maps were tourist grade, enemy dispositions were imprecise. Even the presence of a second campus of St George's University at Grand Anse was unknown to many commanders until the Rangers stumbled upon it later that day. At Point Salines, Rangers quickly engaged the Grenadian People's Revolutionary Army positions, supported by Cuban personnel assigned to the airport project. Though many Cubans were officially construction workers, a significant number were armed and organised, blurring the line between civilian and combatant in the first hours of the fight. The Rangers pressed forward under fire, overrunning anti-aircraft guns and pushing defenders off the runway. Casualties mounted, several Americans were killed or wounded before the strip was secured. By mid-morning, C-130 transports began landing with reinforcements. The airhead held, but only narrowly. Communication failures compounded the danger. Naval gunfire, close air support and ground units often struggled to coordinate, a problem that would continue to haunt the operation for days. While the Rangers fought in the south, Marines of the 22nd Marine Amphibious Unit executed helicopter assaults near Pearls Airfield. Rough seas had earlier forced the cancellation of an amphibious landing. The helicopters achieved surprise instead. Grenadian resistance collapsed quickly. By early morning, Pearls was in Marine hands, opening the northern half of the island to a follow-on operation and sealing off potential reinforcement routes. The contrast between north and south was stark. Where Marines encountered scattered, disorganised resistance, the Rangers at Point Salines faced determined fire from prepared positions. The disparity underscored how unevenly the Grenadian defences had been arrayed and how little US planners truly knew about them. By late morning, another urgency asserted itself. Rangers advancing east of Point Salines reached the True Blue campus of St George's University Medical School. There, American students who spent days under curfew watched armed soldiers emerge from the tree line. Some believed they were Grenadian troops, others fearing something worse. When the Rangers identified themselves, relief swept the campus. Yet the mission was incomplete. More than half the students weren't there. Only after hurried questioning and improvised communications did commanders learn of the Grand Anse campus several miles away. The discovery forced an immediate recalculation under fire. A heliborne rescue the next day would extract the remaining students, but the delay exposed again how intelligence gaps translated directly into operational risk. In St George's, the situation was more precarious. A Navy SEAL team had secured Government House and Scone, but the operation went awry when helicopters were damaged and communications severed. Grenadian troops supported by armoured vehicles surrounded the compound. With radios failing, the team improvised, eventually using a civilian telephone to reach US Air Force controllers in the US and call in AC-130 gunship support. The episode would later be mythologized, simplified and misattributed, but the underlying facts revealed a desperate ad hoc solution born of fractured command and control. The gunship's intervention broke the siege. By the next day, Marines advancing from the north relieved the defenders. Scone survived, but the incident would become emblematic of the operation's contradictions, tactical bravery, and compensating for systemic failure. By nightfall on the 25th of October, the United States controlled both of Grenada's airfields. Hundreds of American students had been located and secured, yet fighting continued across the island and confusion remained widespread. Units operated on partial information. Friendly forces occasionally became perilously close to one another. 18 US servicemen would die in the campaign, many in incidents linked to intelligence and coordination failures. From Washington, the first statements framed the day as a decisive success. From the ground, it felt unfinished and fragile. The invasion had achieved its opening objectives, but at a cost that hinted at deeper institutional problems. Grenada had been entered at speed and surprise, but it had not yet been mastered. Part 3. Fog, Friction and Friendly Fire. Shortly after sunrise on the 26th of October 1983, a Marine helicopter skimmed low over the turquoise curve of Grand Anse Beach. Below, clusters of American medical students, some waving towels, others frozen in disbelief, looked up as the rotors thundered overhead. The previous day's promise of rescue had not reached them. Now, at last, it was arriving, improvised and hurried, amid a battlefield still very much alive. The second day of the invasion would prove decisive, not because resistance suddenly stiffened, but because the operation's deepest weaknesses were exposed. Victory, it turned out, would depend less on overwhelming force than on how much confusion US units could survive. The existence of the Grand Anse campus of St. George's University had come as a shock to US commanders on the 25th of October. Intelligence failures meant the site had not appeared in pre-invasion planning. Overnight, Rangers and Marines cobbled together a plan. Helicopters borrowed from Marine units would lift the students out under the cover of naval aviation. The rescue succeeded. All students were evacuated without injury, an outcome later cited as proof of the operation's necessity. Yet the circumstances told a more complicated story. The mission relied on borrowed aircraft, ad hoc coordination, and pilots flying unfamiliar routes under the threat, real or imagined, of anti-aircraft fire. It worked not because of planning, but despite its absence. Elsewhere on the island, the lack of unified command structure began to exact a toll. Overall authority rested uneasily between Washington, the Atlantic Command in Norfolk, and Vice Admiral Joseph Metcalf III aboard the amphibious flagship USS Guam. Army and Marine units operated under parallel chains of command, often receiving fragmentary or delayed orders. The consequences were immediate. Airspace over Grenada became crowded and dangerous as Army helicopters, Marine aircraft, Navy jets, and Air Force gunships converged with limited coordination. On multiple occasions, US forces came perilously close to engaging one another, a risk amplified by incompatible radios and unfamiliar procedures. Nowhere were these problems clearer than on the Calvinia Peninsula east of Point Salines. Intelligence suggested the area might harbour Grenadian and Cuban forces. On the 26th of October, Rangers were ordered to conduct an air assault to clear it. What followed was a near disaster. Helicopters flew into unexpectedly heavy fire. Several were shot down or damaged, spilling troops into mangrove swamps and shallow water. Casualties mounted. The resistance encountered was far lighter than feared, raising uncomfortable questions about the intelligence that had justified the mission in the first place. Later reviews would cite Calvinia as emblematic of Grenada's lessons. Poor reconnaissance, rushed decision-making, and a willingness to accept risk without adequate information. By the evening of the 26th of October, US control over Grenada was expanding. Marines pushed south from Pearls towards St. George's. The 82nd Airborne Division flowed through Point Salines, assuming responsibility for security and stabilisation. Grenadian resistance dwindled, though sporadic sniping continued. Cuban personnel, many of whom had fought on the first day, now began surrendering in significant numbers. Their presence, hundreds of armed men, officially described as construction workers, would later complicate diplomatic narratives about the invasion's necessity and proportionality. The fighting was no longer in doubt, but its price was becoming clear. American casualties, including deaths caused by friendly fire and accidents, undercut claims of a clean clinical operation. A tragic airstrike on a mental hospital would kill civilians, a mistake acknowledged only later and largely absent from the early public briefings. In Washington, officials emphasized momentum and success. On the ground, commanders worked to impose order on a patchwork battlefield shaped as much by miscommunication as by enemy action. By the end of the second full day, Grenada was effectively in US hands. Yet the invasion's meaning was still unsettled. The students were safe, the Revolutionary Military Council was collapsing, and Cuban resistance was broken. At the same time, the operation had revealed deep institutional flaws that could not be ignored. The island had been secured. The narrative, however, was far from finished. Part 4. The Collapse of Power. On the morning of the 27th of October 1983, the guns around St. George's finally fell silent. Smoke still drifted above the harbour, curling around the pastel facades of colonial buildings and the battered stone of Fort Rupert, renamed Fort George, where Maurice Bishop had been executed only 8 days earlier. US Marines moved cautiously through the capital, weapons raised, past abandoned checkpoints and empty guard posts. The revolutionary state that had ruled Grenada for 4 years was no longer assuming orders. It was dissolving in place. What followed was not a dramatic final battle, but a methodical unravelling of authority, ideology, and resistance. By the third day of the invasion, the People's Revolutionary Army was finished as a coherent fighting force. Units that had resisted on the first day were either destroyed, dispersed, or cut off from command. The Revolutionary Military Council, led by Hudson Austin, ceased issuing directives as US forces occupied government buildings and communications centres in St George's. Austin and senior members of the council were taken into custody without a final stand. Their removal was swift and largely anticlimactic, an abrupt end to a regime that had come to power through internal violence and collapsed under external force. For many Grenadians, the suddenness was disorientating. The curfew that had frozen daily life since Bishop's execution vanished overnight. Radios resumed broadcasting, now under US supervision. Word spread that the army was gone. Perhaps the most symbolically charged moment of the invasion came not in combat but in surrender. Hundreds of Cuban nationals, some uniformed soldiers, others construction workers issued weapons during the fighting, began turning themselves into US units. They emerged from work camps, construction sites, and improvised defensive positions, stacking rifles and ammunition in neat piles. Washington had long portrayed the Cuban presence as evidence of a military threat in the Eastern Caribbean. The reality proved more complex. While Cuban officers had advised and in some cases fought alongside Grenadian units, most of those captured were lightly armed and ill-prepared for sustained combat against US forces. Their rapid capitulation underscored how decisively the balance of power had shifted. With organised resistance broken, the mission changed character. Combat units transitioned into occupation forces. Patrols fanned out across Grenada's interior, moving through nutmeg groves and steep ravines in search of hidden weapons caches and isolated holdouts. The 82nd Airborne Division, now fully deployed, took the lead in stabilisation, relieving Rangers and Marines who had borne the brunt of the initial assault. The emphasis was on control rather than confrontation. Roadblocks replaced firefights, searches replaced assaults. In scattered incidents, US troops encountered snipers or nervously armed civilians, but these were quickly contained. To lend legitimacy to the operation, a small Caribbean peace force arrived, composed of troops and police from neighbouring island states. Their numbers were modest, symbolic rather than decisive, but their presence allowed Washington to emphasise a regional dimension to what had been overwhelmingly an American intervention. In practice, US forces retained full control. The peacekeepers lacked heavy equipment, intelligence and operational authority. Still, their arrival marked the transition from invasion to administration, from combat to governance. Attention now turned to political reconstruction. Governor-General Paul Scone, freed from confinement at Government House, moved quickly to appoint an interim administration. Nicholas Braithwaite was named to head an advisory council tasked with steering Grenada back towards elections. The process unfolded under the protection and scrutiny of US troops. Ministries reopened, civil servants returned to offices stripped of revolutionary slogans. The People's Revolutionary Army was formally disbanded, its weapons seized, its command structure erased. For Washington, these steps were proof that Operation Urgent Fury had achieved its political aims. For critics, they confirmed that regime change, not merely evacuation or stabilisation, had been the invasion's true objective. By the end of October, Grenada was no longer a battlefield. The beaches were empty of landing craft. Helicopters still thudded overhead, but now carried supplies, not assault teams. The island's war had lasted days. Its consequences would last far longer. The collapse of power in Grenada appeared at first glance decisive and clean, yet beneath the surface questions were already forming about legality, proportionality, intelligence and precedent. The fighting was over. The argument about what it meant had only begun. Part 5. The long week after victory. In the hills above St George's, US patrols moved in single file across muddy tracks, boots slick with red clay, radios crackling in the heat. The enemy no longer wore uniforms or manned checkpoints. If resistance remained, it was hidden in abandoned farmhouses beneath cocoa trees or buried in the undergrowth alongside rusting rifles and crates of ammunition. From the 28th of October into early November 1983, US forces conducted systematic sweep operations across the island. These missions were designed to locate weapons caches, detain remaining members of the disbanded People's Revolutionary Army, and ensure that no organised guerrilla resistance could emerge. Patrols uncovered thousands of small arms, Kalashnikov rifles, machine guns, rocket launchers, many of them supplied by Cuba and Eastern Bloc states during the Bishop years. The anticipated insurgency never materialised. Grenada's revolutionary government had collapsed too quickly, its authority too brittle to leave behind a coherent underground movement. Unlike conflicts in Central America, there was no countryside prepared to sustain prolonged resistance. Instead, the dominant mood among Grenadians was exhaustion. As order returned, so did scrutiny. Cuban prisoners, more than 600 in total, were held temporarily before being repatriated. Grenadian detainees faced a different future, many awaiting their trial for their roles in the execution of Maurice Bishop and his supporters. The prisons they entered were overcrowded and the legal process moved slowly, casting a long shadow over the island's return to normality. Civilian casualties came into sharper focus. During the fighting, US aircraft mistakenly struck a mental hospital, killing 17 patients and one hospital staff member. The incident was initially underreported, overshadowed by official statements emphasizing precision and restraint. Only later would it become part of the invasion's moral accounting, a reminder that even brief wars leave civilian scars. In the United States, the narrative hardened quickly. President Reagan praised the operation as a model of decisive leadership and military professionalism. Senior commanders echoed the sentiment, describing the campaign as a complete success that had rescued American citizens and restored democratic prospects to Grenada. Behind closed doors, however, military officers were already cataloguing failures. Communications breakdowns, intelligence gaps, and inter-service rivalry had come dangerously close to disaster. That these flaws had not derailed the mission owed more to improvisation and individual initiative than to institutional excellence. For Grenadians, daily life resumed under occupation. Schools opened, fishing boats returned to sea, American soldiers became a familiar sight, sometimes welcomed, sometimes resented, often simply endured. The revolution that had promised transformation was gone, replaced by a provisional calm enforced by foreign arms. The island's political future was being shaped quietly, with interim leaders preparing the ground for elections while US forces guaranteed security. It was an uneasy equilibrium, one that depended entirely on continued American commitment. By early November, combat operations officially ceased. The invasion was over, but the consequences were not. Grenada had been stabilised, yet the invasion had exposed uncomfortable truths about the limit of intelligence, the hazards of secrecy, and the ease with which short wars can generate long debates. The long week after victory revealed what the first days had concealed, that Operation Urgent Fury was as much an exercise in damage control as in force projection. The island was quiet again. The questions it raised would travel far beyond its shores. Part 6. The World Reacts. On the afternoon of the 2nd of November 1983, diplomats filed into the vast hall of the United Nations General Assembly in New York. Outside, autumn rain streaked the East River. Inside, the mood was unmistakably cold. Grenada, an island smaller than most American counties, had become the subject of a global reckoning. When the votes were counted, the verdict was stark. The General Assembly condemned the invasion as a flagrant violation of international law. The tally was overwhelming. The fighting on Grenada had ended. The argument over its meaning was just beginning. Within days of the invasion, international opposition crystallized. A draft resolution in the United Nations Security Council deploring the intervention failed only because the United States exercised its veto. When the matter moved to the General Assembly, there was no such shield. By a vote of 108 to 9 with 27 abstentions, the world's governments formally rejected Washington's justification for the use of force. The language was blunt. The resolution described the invasion as a breach of the UN Charter and of Grenada's sovereignty. For many states, particularly small and non-aligned countries, the case struck close to home. If Grenada could be invaded on short notice, they reasoned, so could they. Even among close allies, support was strained. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, whose country remained Grenada's former colonial power and whose monarch was still Grenada's head of state, was angered by the lack of consultation. Though she defended the United States publicly, private communications revealed deep frustration with the manner and speed of the decision. Thatcher had been wary of military action and thought that Reagan agreed with her. Late on the 24th of October, Reagan told Thatcher he was considering military action. Thatcher fired back, "This action will be seen as an intervention by a Western country in the affairs of a small independent state, however unattractive its regime." But the operation was already underway. Thatcher was furious that she'd been misled about US plans to invade a Commonwealth country, of which the Queen was head of state. The government's position was even more awkward because British Foreign Secretary Geoffrey Howe had told Parliament on the 24th of October, "I have no reason to think that US intervention is likely." Thatcher and Howe were given a hard time in Parliament and the media, but they mostly bit their lip given the larger interests at stake in the Cold War and the Middle East. In private, they were deeply shaken, not just by the lack of consultation, but deliberate concealment by the US. A UK government planner noted that the success of the operation meant the US, rather than the Soviet Union, was likely to risk the threat or use of force elsewhere. Canada and Trinidad and Tobago voiced open criticism. In Western Europe, governments worried that the invasion weakened international norms at a moment when Cold War tensions were already acute. Do check out episode 316, entitled 1983, the year the Cold War almost turned hot, for some more detail about the tensions that were around in the world in 1983. Only a handful of states, most prominently some members of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, offered unqualified support, and even there the political calculus was complex. At the center of the controversy lay legality. The Reagan administration advanced three overlapping justifications: the protection of US nationals, a request for assistance from Caribbean states, and an appeal said to have been transmitted secretly from Governor General Paul Scone. Critics dismantled each claim in turn. Legal scholars pointed out that most American students had not been under imminent threat and that evacuation alone could have addressed their safety. Others argued that the regional request was orchestrated after US planning was already well advanced. The claim of an invitation from Scone proved the most contentious. Evidence suggested that any such request was informal, retrospective, or conveyed only after the invasion had begun. The debate spilled into journals, courtrooms of opinion, and congressional hearings. For supporters, Grenada demonstrated moral clarity and decisive leadership. For critics, it marked a dangerous precedent, one that blurred humanitarian language with power politics. In Washington, officials rejected the international backlash as misplaced and hypocritical. President Ronald Reagan framed the operation as a rescue mission and a blow against communist expansion. Administration spokesmen emphasized the gratitude of evacuated students and the rapid restoration of order on the island. Privately, however, senior figures acknowledged the fragility of the legal case. Later memoirs would concede that the students' safety had only been one factor, and not necessarily the decisive one in the decision to intervene. The deeper objective was the removal of the Revolutionary Military Council and the elimination of Cuban influence on Grenada. For Grenada itself, the diplomatic storm was largely abstract. On the island, daily life continued to normalise under the protection of US troops and the interim government led by Nicholas Braithwaite. Yet the island's sovereignty, nominally restored, was now inseparable from foreign power. The contradiction was inescapable. Grenada had been stabilised, but at the cost of becoming a symbol of intervention, of Cold War anxiety, and the uneasy balance between legality and force. By late 1983, the immediate diplomatic crisis had faded, but its implications endured. The invasion of Grenada entered textbooks and war colleges not only as a military operation but as a case study in international response. It demonstrated how swiftly narratives could diverge: victory on the ground, condemnation abroad, applause at home, unease overseas. Grenada's war had lasted 8 days. Its reverberations would echo for decades. Part 7. Lessons written in the margins. In a windowless briefing room at the Pentagon, weeks after the last American troops have left Grenada, officers sat hunched over after-action reports thick with annotations. Maps were spread across tables, their margins crowded with handwritten notes. Radio frequencies that failed, units that never received orders, aircraft that nearly collided in the dark. The war was over, but the reckoning had begun. Grenada would not be remembered inside the US military primarily for its firefights or its politics. It would be remembered as a warning. Publicly, senior commanders described Operation Urgent Fury as a success. The objectives had been met, American citizens evacuated, a hostile regime removed, Cuban forces expelled, elections promised. Yet within the armed services the tone was markedly different. Classified reviews and later testimony acknowledged that the operation had been dangerously close to catastrophe, not because of enemy strength but because of American disarray. Units had deployed with incompatible radios, pilots flew missions without reliable ground coordination, intelligence had been fragmentary to the point of absurdity, some commanders relied on tourist maps, the absence of a single authoritative chain of command meant decisions were delayed, duplicated or contradicted. Grenada laid bare tensions that had been building since Vietnam. The Army, Navy, Air Force and Marine Corps trained separately, planned separately and often fought separately. In Grenada, their separation translated into operational friction. 3 different commands initially prepared plans to seize the same airfield, Point Salines, without knowing of one another's intentions. Disaster was only avoided at the last moment. The experience was particularly sobering for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Their chairman at the time, John W. Vesey Jr., later acknowledged that the system for conducting joint operations was badly flawed. Grenada, he conceded, had succeeded by good fortune and bravery, not by design. Perhaps no lesson cut deeper than the failure of intelligence. The Central Intelligence Agency had no agents on Grenada. The National Security Agency provided limited signals intelligence, but there was little human reporting to verify it. Even basic facts such as the number and location of American students were wrong on the eve of the invasion. These shortcomings had real consequences. Missions were launched against suspected enemy concentrations that proved insignificant, while genuine risks went unrecognized. The near disaster at the Calvini Peninsula, where helicopters flew into unexpected fire, became a case study in the dangers of acting on thin intelligence. The lessons of Grenada did not remain confined to internal memoranda. They fed directly into the broader debate about how the US military should be organized in the post-Vietnam late Cold War era. Lawmakers who had long argued that the services were too autonomous now had a concrete example to point to. In 1986, Congress passed the Goldwater-Nichols Department of Defense Reorganization Act. This strengthened the authority of unified combatant commanders, reducing the operational role of the service chiefs and placing joint operations at the center of American warfighting doctrine. Though prompted by multiple factors, Grenada was repeatedly cited in hearings as proof that reform was overdue. The changes were structural, but their intent was cultural, to force the services to plan, train, and fight together or risk failure. Ironically, Grenada would later be invoked as both a cautionary tale and a template. Subsequent US interventions, most notably in Panama in 1989 and the Persian Gulf in 1991, were planned with Grenada's lessons in mind. Joint command structures were clearer, intelligence integration improved, coordination became a watchword. In hindsight, Grenada occupied a liminal place in US military history. It was small enough to survive mistakes, yet serious enough to expose them. Had the enemy been stronger or the terrain less forgiving, the outcome may have been very different. For the American public, Grenada faded quickly, eclipsed by larger events and reassured by declarations of victory. Inside the Pentagon it lingered. Officers who had fought there carried its memory forward, shaping doctrine, training, and expectations. The island itself had returned to quiet, but the margins of those after-action reports, scribbled notes, crossed-out assumptions, unanswered questions, the future of American military reform was already being written. Part 8. After the applause. In December 1984, voters lined up outside polling stations across Grenada under a bright Caribbean sun. There were no curfews, no soldiers at checkpoints, no helicopters overhead. Ballot boxes replaced rifles. For the first time since the revolution of 1979 and more than a year after the invasion, Grenadians were choosing a government in relative calm. The war that had brought the world's attention to their island was over. What remained was memory. The elections, supervised with international assistance, returned Grenada to parliamentary rule. Herbert Blaise became Prime Minister, leading a government committed to rebuilding institutions dismantled during the revolutionary years. The interim administration, headed by Nicholas Braithwaite, stepped aside, its task completed. For Washington, the vote was validation. Operation Urgent Fury was now framed as a successful intervention that had restored democracy. For Grenadians, the meaning was more personal and more ambivalent. Stability had returned, but it rested on the wreckage of a political experiment and the trauma of invasion. The men responsible for the execution of Maurice Bishop and his colleagues were tried and convicted, receiving life sentences. The trials were legally complex and politically charged, stretching on for years and dividing public opinion. For some Grenadians, the convictions brought closure. For others, they reopened wounds from a period that defied easy moral clarity. Maurice Bishop himself became a contested symbol. To supporters, he remained a charismatic leader whose revolution was hijacked and destroyed. To critics, he was an authoritarian whose suspension of democracy helped pave the way to catastrophe. His body was never recovered, a physical absence that mirrored the unresolved debates surrounding his legacy. However, in 2009, Point Salines Airport, a key objective in the overthrow of the new dual movement that Bishop had founded, was renamed Maurice Bishop International Airport. 25th of October, the day of the invasion, was declared a national holiday, Thanksgiving Day. Officially, it commemorated liberation from military rule and the restoration of democratic life. Unofficially, it marked the moment when Grenada's fate was seized by forces beyond its control. The holiday captured the paradox at the heart of the invasion. It was both deliverance and disruption, rescue and rupture. Grenadians learnt to live with that duality, even as outsiders argued over it. In the United States, it was remembered when at all as a short, victorious war that followed the trauma of Vietnam and preceded the long conflicts of the post-Cold War era. Politically, it bolstered the confidence of the Reagan administration and reinforced a belief in the efficacy of limited force. Yet within military and diplomatic communities, Grenada endured as a case study, invoked in classrooms, cited in reform debates, and dissected in professional journals. It was the rare operation that was simultaneously a success and a warning. Measured in territory, Grenada was tiny. Measured in consequence, it was not. The invasion influenced US military reform, reshaped Joint Command doctrine, and foreshadowed a more interventionist American posture in the final years of the Cold War. It also underscored the vulnerability of small states caught in ideological struggle, where internal conflict could invite external force with startling speed. For Grenada, the years after 1983 were marked by rebuilding rather than reckoning. Tourism returned, institutions stabilised, the island moved forward without fully resolving how to remember the revolution, the executions, or the invasions that followed. Today, the runway at Port Salines, now Maurice Bishop International Airport, handles commercial flights rather than paratroopers. The harbour at St George's is once again dominated by fishing boats and cruise ships. The jungle has reclaimed many of the scars of war. But the story of 1983 remains embedded in Grenada's political DNA and in America's strategic memory. It is a reminder that even the shortest wars leave long shadows, and that history's smallest stages can host events with global consequences. The episode extras such as videos, photos and other content are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.